Larry Fink's been particularly vocal about that. And what GFANZ proposes specifically is merging the members of GFANZ with the multilateral development banks as a way to basically use the same debt slavery model that the MDBs have been criticized for using. But instead of using it to further U.S. empire or the dollar and things of that nature, it's instead the proposal is to use it to create better enabling environments in countries for the green investments of these large financial institutions and asset managers. So it's basically like perpetuating the same model of the MDBs, but having basically Wall Street run it under the guise that it's a planetary necessity. And that we can't get to net zero without this, which frankly, if you look into the explanations for that, there's no way that's the case. But that's, how I first started writing about Larry Fink was because of his involvement in this relatively open plan to create a new financial system, which, among other things, doesn't just rest on the MDBs, but also on the development of global carbon markets, which comes up in this particular piece in a pretty meaningful way.
When you look at this, Whitney, do you consider this as BlackRock using their power to rent seek off government policy?
As well. So a lot of big moves are being made through these institutions for part of this new global financial governance system, as GFANZ calls it.
But therefore, Whitney, did you raise your eyes recently when Elon Musk raised the idea of a carbon tax system? We spoke about him in our previous interview.
Yeah, I wasn't really surprised because it's a position that Elon Musk has had for some time. That particular tweet you're referring to that was relatively recent is not the first time that he's sort of openly or publicly endorsed the idea of either a carbon tax or carbon markets. He's also endorsed a lot of other things that are supported more broadly by groups like the World Economic Forum, like UBI, for example, and some other policies as well. And, a lot of the success of Tesla, for example, has been related to sort of this ESG push in some ways, and in terms of the idea that we need to replace all fossil fuel consuming vehicles with electric vehicles. And Tesla is obviously the market leader in that, at least in the United States. So he definitely seems to be aligned in significant ways with some of these policies. So I'm not particularly surprised. I mean, in terms of his what he says, his rhetoric, he's a lot more, he's very openly anti-woke, quote unquote. And have gotten a lot of pushback as a result. And so if you notice, people like Fink, but other people as well, have moved their rhetoric away from those seeking to appeal to the political left in the public side of the public-private partnership, leaning into the private aspect of the public-private partnership and having more right-leaning talking points. But ultimately, all are trying to lead you to the same exact system of digital ID, programmable surveillable money, and global carbon markets. And I think, the carbon market in particular, it's sort of hard to extricate that from the climate change, situation. But I think it looks like, people like Fink and some of the people in that particular space are going to attempt to market it as something that can make people very wealthy or allow them to get quick access to capital by tokenizing their land holdings and like fractionalizing their private property, using different things that haven't been able to be financialized before, and then bringing that on chain and using that as collateral, receiving loans that way and all of that. There's a lot of ambitious plans in that particular space. And aside from that, there's been this push led by the Rockefeller Foundation and some other groups through this whole push for natural asset corporations, where they basically openly talk about the idea to expand the amount of assets in the existing financial policy or create a particular entity. If it gets pushed back as being openly part of the government, they privatize it and then no one complains. So a good example of this that I refer to a lot is the post 9/11 Dragnet surveillance operation that was going to be housed in DARPA, which is part of the U.S. military, called Total Information Awareness. And then this was privatized by Peter Thiel and some other people and turned into Palantir. DARPA's LifeLog project, in the same vein, was privatized and turned into Facebook, again with the involvement of Peter Thiel. People on the left and right alike were extremely opposed to these programs when they were being run by the military, by DARPA, but then you go and turn them into a private sector entity that does essentially the same thing, or really does do the same thing, and it's embraced or treated as private sector innovation and what have you. And people, think because of the rhetoric that, oh, this is, everything's being handed back to the free market. But these companies, Palantir being an example, that was set up with state involvement, CIA involvement, right? So it's not really the free market, it's cronyism, it's crony capitalism, it's cartelism. And so used in a documented way over the past 20 years, and people are unfortunately falling for it once again. But it's important to point out that I think Mark would agree that in the context we're talking about it here, we're not necessarily referring to like free market capitalism so much as the crony capitalism that dominates, Wall Street and other, nexuses of power like that.
Right. So you're basically saying Milei is being consistent with the principles of anarcho-capitalism by moving these into the private markets, but he's actually moving them to the worst people in the world that aren't truly free private markets. They're actually part of the kind of US crony system.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Whitney, why do you think this happens? Why do you think this bait and switch happens? What happens to the likes of Trump? What happens to the likes of Milei that forces them to? Is there any sympathy given to Milei that perhaps to get where he had to form a coalition because he didn't have enough seats in parliament? So he had to form a coalition. There's some influence there. Is it to get things done? For his end goal, does he, it's short term, feel like he?
The past several years, post COVID, the themes of their annual meetings have been framed around rebuilding trust. And so they know which group does not trust them, the group that's pushing back against ESG and these other talking points and initiatives that have been coming out of the WEF for several years. And now in order to rebuild trust, they're putting different figures, different people, and different talking points, in front of people and seeing if they'll be more accepting of the ultimate game plan if it's framed in different terms that appeal more to their values and their sensibilities, and also framed as opposing, particular figures that they don't like or they don't trust.
It's very interesting because as we head towards another election this year, which obviously will be a huge shit show, that this
yes,
there is. If you escape the mainstream media that people hate so much, and I'm not a huge fan of U.S. Mainstream media, and
if a particular population, such as in the U.S., pushes against the public sector implementing that, like with CBDCs, for example, there's an obvious effort to try and sell what is functionally the same thing as a private sector entity, and there's really no discussion of that in the CBDC debate. In independent media at all, of the threat of, JP Morgan and deposit tokens or tokenized deposits, which is definitely a thing that all the Wall Street banks, the big ones, are pushing into. The idea of a bank issued, stable coins and all of that as an alternative to the digital dollar, and things of that nature. All of that can be just as programmable and surveillable as a CBDC. So all of this rhetoric that we're against CBDCs seems to be, sort of to make people feel like they've won, in a sense, and that they're going to get something better for freedom and financial freedom and sovereignty. But functionally, it's just as bad, if not worse, right? I think people need to keep in mind that there are intense efforts. People, and the algorithm favors extensively. Someone like Tucker Carlson, his father ran the U.S. Information Agency under Reagan, which was in charge of propaganda operations in favor of the arming the Contras in Nicaragua, aspects of Iran-Contra and its cover-up, all sorts of things that were going on during the Reagan era, particularly in Latin America, where the CIA was overseeing dirty wars and mass elimination of political dissidents by CIA-backed dictatorships. Tucker Carlson's dad was responsible for that, and then young Tucker Carlson went and traveled to see the Contras, while his father was doing that, and had a very favorable opinion of them, among other things, and has had a rather interesting trajectory within mainstream media itself. I believe before Fox, he was on MSNBC, very cozy with figures like Rachel Maddow, for example, and then sort of has become the figure that he was at Fox, and has since left Fox, and because of that firing has this renewed or